My ex-husband forged documents to ruin me, but in court, the truth came out. The life she had carefully built over the years crumbled in a matter of days. A woman who had always followed the rules, worked hard, and put her trust in the people closest to her found herself betrayed in the most devastating way. She had been sitting at her office desk when the email arrived, a formal notification informing her of immediate termination. Confused, she read through the message multiple times, unable to comprehend what had gone wrong. Her performance reviews had always been stellar, and she had never been involved in any misconduct. But as she read further, her breath caught. She was being accused of financial fraud, a charge that not only destroyed her career but threatened to tarnish her reputation forever. Shaking, she rushed to her superior's office, pleading for an explanation, but all she received was cold indifference. "The evidence speaks for itself," her boss had said, sliding a file toward her. Trembling, she flipped through the documents, her heart pounding as she saw financial statements with her name signed at the bottom, statements she had never seen before. The amounts were staggering, transfers she had never authorized. It didn't take long for her to recognize what had happened. There was only one person who had both the motive and access to pull this off, her ex-husband. They had divorced a year prior, a bitter and exhausting process that left her emotionally drained. He had always been manipulative, charming in public but cruel behind closed doors. When the marriage ended, she thought she had freed herself from his control, but now she realized he had never let go. He had worked in finance, skilled at maneuvering money in ways that weren't easily traceable, and somehow, he had managed to make her the scapegoat for something he had orchestrated. But why now? And to what extent had he gone to destroy her? The repercussions were immediate. Her coworkers whispered behind her back, their eyes filled with suspicion. Friends who had once been supportive grew distant, hesitant to be associated with someone accused of fraud. Even worse, her ex-husband's influence reached beyond her professional life. She received a letter from the family court stating that her right to shared custody of her daughter was being reevaluated. He had somehow used these falsified documents to paint her as financially reckless and unfit to care for their child. It was a calculated attack from a man who knew exactly how to dismantle her world, piece by piece. As she sat in her now empty apartment, the silence around her felt suffocating. She had to clear her name, not just for herself but for her daughter. But how could she fight against someone so meticulous in his deceit? She had no legal expertise, no financial resources left, and her reputation was in ruins. The walls were closing in, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly powerless. The next morning, she met with a lawyer, scraping together what little savings she had left for an initial consultation. The attorney, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, listened intently as she laid out the details. "Forgery cases are difficult to prove," he finally said, sighing as he flipped through the copies of the documents she had brought. "Especially when the other party has covered their tracks well. Do you have any proof that he did this?" She shook her head. That was the problem. Her ex-husband was careful. He never left traces of his wrongdoings, always ensuring that the blame could be shifted elsewhere. "But it doesn't make sense," she insisted, desperation creeping into her voice. "I would never do something like this. I don't even have access to these accounts. There has to be a way to prove it." The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "The burden of proof isn't on him. It's on you. He has successfully framed you, which means the legal system already sees you as the guilty party. You need to find evidence that absolves you, or at least casts doubt on his claims." He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. "And even if we manage that, there's another issue: your employer. they've already severed ties with you. Even if you prove you're innocent, it won't be easy to repair the damage done. She left the office feeling heavier than before. Not only was she facing legal battles, but she was also fighting against public perception. Her ex-husband had been strategic, spreading the right lies to the right people, ensuring that she would be isolated in every possible way. He had always been good at playing the victim, painting himself as the reasonable, responsible one while making her seem irrational. And now, his act had worked. Returning home, she found an envelope slipped under her door. With shaking hands, she opened it. Inside was a court summons. Her ex-husband was formally seeking full custody of their daughter. Her knees nearly buckled. He wasn't just trying to ruin her professionally, he wanted to take away the one thing that mattered most. The courtroom was filled with murmurs as she stepped inside, her head held high despite the shame weighing on her shoulders. Her ex-husband sat across from her, a smug expression on his face. He was dressed in an expensive suit, his posture relaxed, as if this were just another business deal. Beside him sat his new girlfriend, a well-dressed woman who glanced at her with thinly veiled disdain. The opposing attorney wasted no time attacking her character. "Your Honor, we have reason to believe that the defendant has a history of financial irresponsibility. The fraudulent activity linked to her name is not an isolated incident, but rather part of a pattern of reckless behavior." The words hit like a slap. A pattern? They were twisting the story even further, fabricating a narrative that portrayed her as unstable. She tried to defend herself, but every argument was met with skepticism. "Why should we believe you?" the judge asked, reviewing the documents in front of him. "The evidence suggests otherwise." Her ex-husband smirked, and her stomach twisted in fury. He was winning. He had set the trap so perfectly that even the legal system was on his side. As the session ended, she stepped outside the courtroom, barely able to hold herself together. Reporters were already gathered, shoving microphones toward her, asking if she had any comments about the accusations. Her ex-husband had fed them the story, ensuring that her humiliation wasn't just confined to the courtroom, it was now public knowledge. The world saw her as a fraud, a liar, a mother unfit for her own child. And the worst part? She had no way to prove them wrong. Days passed in a blur of hopelessness. Then, one evening, as she reviewed the documents again, something caught her eye. A signature, her signature. Only it wasn't hers. It looked close, but there were inconsistencies, small details that didn't match her handwriting. Hope flickered inside her chest. If she could prove that the signature had been forged, she could begin to unravel the lies. Determined, she sought out a handwriting analyst, a professional who could examine the documents. "It's definitely a forgery," the expert confirmed after careful analysis. "The strokes are similar, but there are unnatural pauses, inconsistent pressure. Someone tried to mimic your signature but didn't get it completely right." Her pulse quickened. This was the first real evidence she had. If she could take this to court, if she could prove that the documents were fraudulent, she could finally turn the tables. For the first time in weeks, she felt something she thought she had lost: hope. But hope alone wouldn't win this fight. She needed legal support, and she needed someone who believed in her. That's when she received a call from an unexpected source, an old colleague from work. "I never believed the accusations," the woman said. "And I have access to financial records from our department. Maybe there's something in them that can help you." This was the break she needed. With trembling hands, she met her former colleague in secret, receiving the documents that might just hold the key to her salvation. As she flipped through the pages, a single transaction caught her attention, one that tied directly back to her ex-husband. For the first time, the scales were beginning to tip in her favor. Armed with new evidence, she walked into the courtroom with a renewed sense of purpose. The weight of weeks of humiliation still clung to her, but this time, she wasn't just defending herself, she was fighting back. Her ex-husband sat in his usual place, his confidence unshaken, unaware of the storm about to hit him. The judge called for the proceedings to resume, and her attorney, now emboldened by the documents in hand, wasted no time in presenting the findings. Your Honor, we have undeniable proof that the financial records used against my client were falsified, he declared, handing over the expert analysis of the forged signature and the newly discovered transaction. Her ex-husband's smirk faltered as the judge examined the documents, his sharp gaze narrowing. The courtroom, which had once felt suffocating, was now heavy with tension of a different kind. The prosecution scrambled to counter the revelation, but their arguments held less weight now. It appears there are serious discrepancies in the presented evidence, the judge murmured, flipping through the pages. For the first time since this nightmare began, her ex-husband's composed exterior cracked. He leaned over to his lawyer, whispering furiously, his hands gripping the table as though he could hold on to the power that was slipping through his fingers. Desperation makes people reckless, and her ex-husband was no exception. When confronted with the inconsistencies in the evidence, he attempted to shift blame onto his lawyer, stammering through a weak defense that lacked his usual arrogance. There must have been a misunderstanding, he insisted, but the words fell flat. His attorney, unwilling to take the fall for his deceit, distanced himself immediately, stating that he had only worked with the evidence provided by his client. The judge's expression darkened. Mr. Harris, are you suggesting that this fraudulent evidence was unknowingly presented? The courtroom fell silent as her ex-husband hesitated. Then, as if realizing there was no way out, he made his first mistake. He spoke too much. I only wanted to secure my daughter's custody, he blurted, voice shaking with barely contained frustration. If she had just accepted the settlement, none of this would have been necessary. Gasps filled the courtroom. Her lawyer turned to her with wide eyes, knowing that those words, spoken in front of a judge, were as good as a confession. The judge leaned forward, fingers interlocked, considering the weight of what had just been said. So, you admit to manipulating evidence to gain custody? The silence that followed was suffocating. Her ex-husband's confidence shattered like glass. His usual charm was gone, replaced by the realization that he had dug his own grave. His lawyer, sensing the inevitable, requested a brief recess, but the judge refused. Given the gravity of the situation, I see no reason to delay further, he stated firmly. The opposing legal team scrambled, trying to salvage what little credibility they had left, but there was nothing to be done. The forged documents, the fraudulent accusations, and now his own admission, everything had crumbled under the weight of the truth. Her ex-husband turned to her, his expression a mix of disbelief and resentment. He had underestimated her, believing she would fold under pressure, but now he was the one unraveling. You think you've won? He hissed under his breath. But she didn't respond. There was no need. The truth had already spoken for itself. The judge ordered an immediate review of the custody case, suspending all decisions until further investigation could be conducted. Her ex-husband, once untouchable, was now facing not only the loss of his fabricated case but possible legal repercussions for fraud. The news spread quickly. What was once a one-sided scandal portraying her as a fraud had now flipped, and the media wasted no time in reporting the courtroom bombshell. Headlines changed overnight. No longer was she the disgraced woman who had lost everything, but the victim of a calculated scheme. The same people who once whispered about her in the hallways now avoided eye contact, ashamed of their quick judgments. Her ex-husband, who had basked in public sympathy, was now at the center of scrutiny. His colleagues distanced themselves, his carefully crafted reputation as a respectable businessman crumbling under the weight of his own lies. Despite the shift in public opinion, she felt no satisfaction in his downfall. She had lost too much to celebrate. Instead, she focused on rebuilding, knowing that this was only the beginning of a long journey. Clearing her name was one thing, but reclaiming her daughter's trust, finding stability again, those were battles still to be fought. She received messages of support, apologies from former friends who had turned their backs on her, but she had little energy to acknowledge them. The betrayal had cut too deep. Moving forward wasn't about proving herself to others, it was about reclaiming the life she had fought so hard to protect. With the custody case officially reopened, she prepared for yet another legal battle, though this time, the weight on her shoulders was lighter. Her ex-husband's credibility was in shambles, and his previous accusations had been discredited, but she knew better than to underestimate him. He was wounded, and men like him were dangerous when backed into a corner. Her lawyer advised caution, warning her that he might still attempt to manipulate the situation in his favor. "He's lost control, and that makes him unpredictable," he said gravely. "We have the upper hand, but don't let your guard down." She knew he was right. The man she had once trusted with her life had spent years proving just how far he was willing to go to maintain his power. But this time, she wasn't afraid. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into the courtroom weeks ago, broken and desperate. She had fought back, exposed his lies, and now she was taking control of her own story. No matter what came next, she was ready. The new custody hearing was set, and this time, she walked into the courtroom with the weight of truth on her side. However, her ex-husband was not a man who surrendered easily. He arrived with a different strategy, feigning remorse and claiming he had only acted out of concern for their daughter's well-being. His lawyer painted him as a father who had made misguided choices out of desperation, pleading for leniency. The shift in his demeanor was jarring. Gone was the arrogant man who had tried to destroy her. In his place stood someone who was now playing the role of the misunderstood parent, hoping to salvage what he could. Her lawyer was quick to dismantle his act. "Your Honor, the defendant not only falsified financial records but manipulated the legal system to unjustly strip my client of her parental rights. This was not a desperate mistake. This was a calculated attack," he argued, presenting additional documents that highlighted the extent of the deception. The judge listened intently, his gaze occasionally flickering toward her ex-husband, who sat motionless, his hands clenched together. The weight of the evidence was undeniable, and though her ex-husband's lawyer attempted to redirect the conversation, it was clear that the damage had already been done. The ruling came swiftly. The judge reinstated her custody rights, overturning the previous ruling that had stripped her of time with her daughter. It was a moment she had envisioned countless times, yet when the words were spoken, they barely felt real. Her ex-husband's reaction was silent fury. His fists clenched, his jaw tightened, but he knew better than to protest openly. He had already lost too much credibility to risk another outburst. As the judge finalized the decision, she finally allowed herself to exhale. For the first time in what felt like forever, justice had been served. After the hearing, she stepped outside and was met with the sight of her daughter waiting for her. The moment their eyes met, everything else faded into the background. She knelt down as her daughter ran into her arms, clinging to her tightly as though afraid she would disappear again. "Mommy, I missed you," the little girl whispered. Tears welled in her eyes as she held her daughter close, promising herself that no one would ever take her away again. The fight had been long and cruel, but she had won the only battle that truly mattered. With the courtroom losses piling up, her ex-husband's carefully maintained life began to unravel. His professional reputation, once untouchable, took a devastating hit when word of his fraudulent actions spread. Business associates distanced themselves, reluctant to be linked to a man accused of fabricating evidence for personal gain. The high-powered world he had thrived in now viewed him as a liability rather than an asset. Investors pulled out, colleagues avoided him, and his company, which had once stood as a testament to his success, suffered as a result. But perhaps the most satisfying downfall came from within his own home. His new girlfriend, who had once looked down on her with smug superiority, quickly abandoned him when it became clear he was no longer the powerful man she had admired. Their relationship, built on status and control, crumbled under the weight of public disgrace. Within weeks, her ex-husband found himself alone, with no allies left to protect him. Though she had no intention of seeking revenge, she couldn't ignore the irony of watching him experience the very isolation he had tried to inflict upon her. With the storm finally behind her, she turned her focus toward rebuilding. Though her name had been cleared, the scars left by the ordeal remained. Job opportunities were scarce, many companies were hesitant to take a risk on someone whose name had been tied to scandal, even if she had been proven innocent. It was a harsh reality, but she refused to let it break her. If the corporate world was unwilling to give her a second chance, she would create her own path. She reached out to old colleagues, those who had quietly supported her from the sidelines, and with their help, she began laying the foundation for something new. She decided to start a consulting firm, using her expertise to guide others who had faced similar injustices. It was a daunting challenge, but one that filled her with purpose. Every setback she had endured had given her a unique perspective, one that could help others navigate the same treacherous waters. Slowly, she rebuilt her professional life on her own terms, no longer defined by the lies of her past but by the strength of her survival. And with each step forward, she felt the weight of her former self fading, replaced by the woman she had fought so hard to become. Months later, she received an unexpected call from her ex-husband. His voice, once so commanding, now sounded hollow. "I need to talk," he said, his tone devoid of the arrogance that had once fueled him. Against her better judgment, she agreed to meet him, not out of obligation, but out of curiosity. When she arrived, she was shocked at what she saw. The man before her was a shadow of the one she had once known. His expensive suits were gone, replaced by something far more unremarkable. He had lost weight, his usual confidence stripped away. For the first time, he looked small. "I didn't think it would end like this," he admitted, avoiding her gaze. "I thought I was protecting myself, but in the end, I destroyed everything." She listened, but there was no satisfaction in his suffering, no joy in his downfall. He had ruined himself, not just through his actions against her, but through a lifetime of deceit. "I lost my company, my connections, everything." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." But the words, once so sought after, now meant nothing. She had spent too much time waiting for an apology that could never undo the damage he had caused. She met his eyes, steady and unshaken. "I don't need your apology," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I needed you to be better when it mattered. But now? Now, I just need you to stay out of my life." And with that, she stood, walking away for the last time. He had taken everything from her once, but now, she was the one with power. Not over him, but over her own future, one that he would never again have the ability to ruin. For the first time in years, she felt truly free. There were no more threats lurking in the shadows, no more battles to fight just to prove she was worthy of her own life. The silence that once suffocated her now felt peaceful. Her daughter had settled back into their routine, no longer having to endure the emotional tug-of-war between her parents. She had feared there would be lasting damage, that the lies her ex-husband had told would create a permanent wedge between them, but children had a way of seeing through deception. "I always knew you were telling the truth, Mommy," her daughter had whispered one night, clinging to her tightly. Those words alone made every struggle worth it. Yet, freedom did not mean forgetting. She had lost friends, trust, and countless opportunities because of one man's obsession with control. But rather than dwelling on the past, she used it as fuel. She dove deeper into her consulting work, advocating for those who had faced injustice in legal battles of their own. The more she worked, the more she realized how many people had been in similar situations, wronged, humiliated, and left to pick up the pieces alone. She wasn't just rebuilding her life anymore, she was helping others do the same. The world had once labeled her a victim, but now, she was something else entirely, a survivor who refused to be silenced. Her newfound stability was tested when she received an email from a prestigious firm, one that had previously turned her away due to the scandal. The message was polite, even apologetic, acknowledging that they had acted hastily and expressing interest in working with her. It should have felt like a victory, a moment of validation. Instead, it left her unsettled. Did she really want to work with people who had doubted her so easily? Who had discarded her without hesitation when she needed them most? The temptation was there. Accepting their offer would mean financial security, a chance to regain the professional standing she had lost. But she wasn't the same woman they had abandoned. She no longer needed their approval to feel worthy. So, she declined. She chose her independence, her dignity, over a paycheck. It was a decision her past self would never have made, but now, it felt like the only choice. And as she hit send, rejecting their offer, she felt a sense of power she had never known before. She didn't need validation from those who had doubted her, she had already proven her worth to the only person who truly mattered, herself. Though her ex-husband had faded from her daily life, remnants of his influence still lingered. Occasionally, she would run into someone who had once believed his lies, their faces filled with guilt as they stumbled through awkward conversations. Some apologized outright, others avoided eye contact, unsure of how to address the past. At first, she had resented these encounters, wishing she could erase every reminder of what she had endured. But over time, she realized they no longer held power over her. She no longer needed their remorse. Then, one afternoon, she received a call from an unknown number. Against her better judgment, she answered. "I heard you're doing well," a familiar voice said. Her ex-husband. His tone lacked its usual arrogance, but she had no interest in whatever story he was about to spin. "Don't call me again," she said, her voice steady. "You lost the right to be part of my life." She hung up before he could respond. There was no satisfaction, no dramatic closure, just a simple truth. He was nothing to her now, just a ghost from a past she had long since left behind. The years of struggle had taken their toll, but they had also transformed her into someone stronger, wiser. Opportunities continued to come her way, not because people pitied her, but because she had built something valuable on her own. Her consulting firm had grown, and she found herself surrounded by people who genuinely respected her, not for the battles she had fought, but for the expertise she had cultivated through them. There were still challenges, of course, but now, she faced them with confidence rather than fear. Her daughter was thriving as well, no longer weighed down by the tension that had once ruled their home. They spent more time together, taking weekend trips, creating memories that were theirs alone, untainted by the past. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was theirs, and that was enough. She had once thought happiness was something that had to be earned, something that would only come after she had cleared every obstacle in her path. But now, she understood happiness wasn't a destination. It was a choice, one she made every day. One evening, as she watched the sunset from her balcony, she reflected on everything she had endured. The betrayal, the humiliation, the countless nights spent wondering if she would ever get her life back. And yet, if given the chance to erase it all, she wasn't sure she would. The pain had shaped her, forced her to become someone who no longer lived in the shadows of other people's expectations. She had lost everything once, and instead of breaking, she had rebuilt. And this time, no one could take it from her. Her phone buzzed, a message from a new client, someone facing a legal battle eerily similar to her own. She smiled, knowing she would help them find their way through it, just as she had. Because that was the real victory, not just surviving, but ensuring that no one else had to fight alone. The woman she had been before might have sought revenge, might have wanted to see her ex-husband suffer as she had. But the woman she was now? She had no interest in looking back. Her future was waiting, and for the first time, she was ready to embrace it fully. Freedom, she realized, came with its own burdens. The fear of losing everything had been replaced by the responsibility of maintaining what she had built. Her consulting firm was thriving, but with success came expectations, and she found herself working longer hours than ever. There was always another case, another person who needed her help. Though she was grateful for the opportunities, exhaustion settled in, creeping into her bones like a weight she couldn't shake. Her daughter noticed first. "Mom, you don't smile as much anymore," the little girl said one evening, frowning as she watched her mother bury herself in work. The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. She had fought so hard for this life, yet she was too busy protecting it to enjoy it. That night, she closed her laptop early and took her daughter out for ice cream, promising herself that she wouldn't let her past fears steal the joy of her present. One afternoon, while sorting through old files, she came across a stack of legal documents from her case. The sight of them sent a shiver through her, a reminder of a chapter she had long since closed. But as she flipped through the pages, she found something that stopped her cold, a name she recognized, buried in the financial records. It belonged to someone her ex-husband had worked with, someone who had vouched for him in court. A man who had helped fabricate the accusations against her. The discovery stirred something deep inside her. She had let go of revenge, or so she had thought. But the realization that others had knowingly contributed to her suffering made her blood boil. Should she expose them? Take legal action? She debated for days, wrestling with the urge for justice versus the peace she had fought so hard to find. In the end, she made a choice. She would not allow them to drag her back into the darkness. The truth had already been revealed where it mattered most. It had been months since she last heard from him, but when his name appeared on her caller ID, she hesitated before rejecting the call. Moments later, a message followed, "I need to see you." Against her better judgment, she agreed to meet, though she knew nothing he said could change the past. They sat across from each other at a quiet cafe, a stark contrast to the courtroom where their last battle had played out. He looked tired, his once polished appearance dulled by the weight of his losses. "I lost everything," he admitted, staring into his untouched coffee. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need to know, do you hate me?" The question took her by surprise. There was a time when the answer would have been a resounding yes, but now, looking at him, she felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just indifference. "I don't hate you," she finally said. "But I don't think about you anymore. And that's worse, isn't it?" His face crumpled, and for the first time, she saw him as he truly was, not powerful, not untouchable. Just a man who had destroyed himself. Walking away from that meeting, she felt lighter. The past had lost its hold on her. She had spent so long waiting for justice, for closure, only to realize that she had already won. Her life was hers again, untainted by the shadows of what had been done to her. And with that realization came a newfound sense of freedom. She was no longer just surviving, she was living. Not long after, an unexpected opportunity arose. A publishing house reached out, interested in her story. They wanted her to write about her journey, not just the legal battle, but everything, the loss, the resilience, the road to reclaiming her life. At first, she hesitated. Her past had already been dissected by the media, twisted by those who had doubted her. But this time, the story would be hers to tell, in her own words. And that, she decided, was worth doing. As she sat at her desk, fingers poised over the keyboard, she thought of all the versions of herself that had existed before this moment. The woman who had been betrayed. The mother who had fought for her child. The survivor who had refused to be erased. Each one had led her here, to a place where she was no longer bound by the past, but strengthened by it. She had built a life on her own terms, and no one could take it from her again. Her daughter's laughter echoed from the other room, grounding her in the present. This was what mattered. Not revenge. Not proving anything to the world. Just this, a quiet, steady happiness she had carved out for herself. Smiling, she began to type. Not because she needed closure, but because she finally understood that her story wasn't about what had been done to her. It was about everything she had become despite it. Writing her story proved to be more difficult than she anticipated. Not because she lacked the words, but because revisiting the past required her to step back into the emotions she had long since tried to bury. There were nights when she sat staring at the screen, memories surfacing like ghosts, forcing her to relive the pain, the betrayal, the fear. But alongside those emotions came something unexpected: pride. She had survived. More than that, she had rebuilt. Each chapter she wrote was a reminder of her strength, of the woman she had become despite everything. As the manuscript neared completion, she shared excerpts with close friends, many of whom had stood by her during her darkest days. Their reactions were unanimous: her story needed to be told. Some cried, others simply hugged her, overwhelmed by the raw honesty in her words. "This isn't just your story," one friend told her. "It's the story of every person who's ever been wronged and had to fight to reclaim their life." For the first time, she saw her experience as more than personal. It was a testament to resilience, one that could inspire others to find their own strength. One evening, as she sat in her home office finishing the final chapter, her daughter wandered in, watching her type with curious eyes. "Are you writing about what happened to us?" the little girl asked, her voice laced with both innocence and understanding. She hesitated before nodding, unsure of how much her daughter truly remembered. "It's a story about being strong," she said carefully. "About how, even when things seem impossible, we can find a way forward." Her daughter climbed onto her lap, looking at the screen. "You were always strong, Mommy," she whispered. The words hit her harder than she expected. For so long, she had worried that the custody battle, the accusations, and the legal battles had left scars on her child. But in that moment, she realized something profound. Her daughter had not seen her as a victim. She had seen her as a warrior. And that, more than anything, made every struggle worth it. When the book was published, she braced herself for the reaction. She expected mixed responses, some supportive, others critical, perhaps even renewed scrutiny from those who had believed the lies once before. But the reality surprised her. Readers resonated with her journey, not because it was filled with drama, but because it was real. Strangers reached out, sharing their own experiences, thanking her for giving them a voice. It became more than just a book, it became a movement. Even the media, which had once vilified her, now sought interviews, eager to tell the story they had once so carelessly misrepresented. She was cautious, selective about where she spoke, ensuring that her narrative remained hers to control. This time, she was not at the mercy of the headlines. This time, she dictated how the world saw her. And as she sat in front of cameras, answering questions not as a victim but as a woman who had risen from the ashes, she realized this was the closure she never knew she needed. Months after her book's release, she ran into her ex-husband unexpectedly. It happened in a crowded cafe, where she was meeting a client. She had not seen him since their last conversation, and for a moment, she wondered if he would approach her. He hesitated, clearly torn between pride and regret. Eventually, he chose to do nothing, turning away as if pretending he had not seen her. But she had seen enough. He looked lost, out of place, as if the world had moved on without him. And in truth, it had. His downfall had been his own doing, and for the first time, she felt no anger, no resentment, just detachment. He was no longer a force in her life, no longer a shadow lurking over her future. He was simply someone she used to know. And with that, she turned back to her meeting, knowing that whatever had once tied them together was gone. She had one, not in the way he once feared, but in the way that truly mattered. She had built a life without him, and it was a life worth living. As the years passed, she found herself thinking less and less about the past. It wasn't that she had forgotten, it was that she no longer needed to remember. Her life was full, filled with work she was passionate about, friendships she cherished, and a daughter who continued to amaze her. The struggles that had once defined her were now just pieces of a larger story, a story that no longer held her captive. She had moved forward, not because she had to, but because she had chosen to. One evening, as she and her daughter watched the sunset, the little girl squeezed her hand. "Are you happy now, Mommy?" she asked. The question was simple, yet profound. She smiled, looking at the sky painted in shades of gold and crimson. "Yes," she said softly. "I really am." And for the first time in a long time, she knew that it was the absolute truth. The battles were over, the wounds had healed, and the future was entirely hers to embrace.